So what I'm going to present today is, does Ireland need a small BIM standard, or SBIM, for shortened? My name is Jonathan Reinhardt. I'm a part-time lecturer with TUD, and I'm also a Diatec technical consultant, looking at BIM and Autodesk technologies on a daily basis. So my research is currently kind of work in progress, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to present effectively what I've done to date, and to let you know the direction it's been heading. So just a little bit about the type of research that it is. So currently it's an initial review stage of small BIM implementation, and I've looked at quite a number of papers globally to I suppose to establish how small BIM, looking at different types of project sizes, different types of organizational sizes, primarily design firms, but also some smaller construction firms as well, to see what the trends and commonalities are across them. The review of academic and published research literature, then I will go through briefly then this afternoon as well. I've done a qualitative analysis of the literature as well, and I've also commenced 4 case study projects with different design firms based in Ireland as well. Some of the further stages that I haven't yet got to is perhaps the quantitative analysis and case study, or return on investment for small BIM as well, which I'll establish as I go through it as well. So also the question, will a small BIM standard improve or hinder small firms? So that's still an open question, has not inconclusive as of yet, purely just based on the amount of research that is required into it before we have a solid answer on it. But hopefully the progress will give you some insight into small BIM adoption and implementation globally today. So some of the objectives I looked at initially was establishing if SBIM will improve or hinder micro and SME firms, assess small BIM industry trends, and understand small BIM adoption research as well. So I wanted to look at the research out there as well, to see what the landscape of that looked like. And some of the key papers I suppose came across and have analysed, started in Ireland, looking at this paper by Carroll and Macaulay. And what I've noticed through a lot of papers, BIM barriers, regardless of organization size, a lot of it comes down to finance, poor communication, technology adoption as well. And exactly what this paper shows here, I found this occur in a lot of papers, and lack of skills as well within that, and then even down to lack of standards and legislation. And then in this particular paper, the research established that the productivity gains associated with BIM were realised for both large and for small enterprises. And this particular paper by Macaulay and Carroll was focused on the SME sector in Ireland, just to establish that. So this is to give you an idea of the type of papers and the scope of papers that I have been researching. So if BIM forms fundamental part of the business, it does encourage collaboration as well, which was established in this particular paper. And there is a potential then to increase your customer or an organizational end user or consumer expectations as well, greater exposure to larger projects as well, which I'll also point out in one of my case studies. I had a similar result. So I also looked further afield beyond Ireland, looking over to Australia, New Zealand area as well, and very similar trends came up around there as well. So they established that the primary focus should be training of the local market, particularly of SMEs. An SME with a lack of knowledge as well, of understanding how they can adapt to new or more efficient procedures, was quite common. And then more publicly, examples of BIM utilization for small or SME projects or SME firms needs to be established as well. But we also need to be careful, or this paper established that there needs to be caution as well to ensure that all company sizes are considered if there's a mandate implemented, for example, which we understand there is a public mandate coming in January, or starting in January 24 in Ireland as well. Make sure they have access to the required skills and support in order that those smaller firms can adapt to that as well. That's quite important. Just one table I analysed in this particular paper by Makowski et al. They established a score basically based on the number of papers that they researched, a score effectively of what was the highest factor in BIM barriers effectively. And the highest one here is where we see the 35 as motivation, surprisingly. But there's also ones like cooperation, software, skills and costs. So that was a scoring effectively of those type of conditions within those papers. And then this is another paper, Sinometric Analysis of BIM Adoption by SMEs as well. Effectively, what they established was BIM adoption by SMEs is not a focus point, but rather the adoption of BIM it's quite generalised in the AEC sector, and I've certainly found this in Ireland and the UK as well. Smaller firms may miss out on benefits from the efficiencies and productivity promised by BIM adoption. And then the adoption of IT, such as BIM, would be longer need. However, it will become a necessity for survival of SMEs as well. And then SMEs contribute significantly not only to the AEC sector, but to national economies of developing countries as well. And that's from that particular paper. And then to remedy that, or solutions to that, is awareness, limited enforcement, skills gap, stakeholder management, all very common trends that I've seen come up in other research as well. And that needs to be considered by SMEs in their BIM adoption as well. And then just on this paper as well, the adoption and implementation of BIM in small and medium-sized enterprises, the steps adopted took a current review of status and potential BIM gain. So again, potential return on investment there. They looked at that. Design of action plans and knowledge management database, taking action by implementing BIM from a socio-technical point of view or staff point of view, perspective through piloting and on projects. So piloting is something we see quite a lot happen, certainly in the Irish industry and the UK as well. And then improving companies' capability and staff development. So upskilling staff, quite important. And then evaluating the step, which involves review and sustaining of the process. So making sure they keep up adopting BIM or implementing BIM and don't necessarily roll back to previous methods perhaps. And then this study concluded or revealed that BIM could easily be implemented through learning by doing for the SME. So using a pilot project effectively with strong top management support. And strong top management support. You know, what I've also seen come up a lot in research is the top-down approach to implementation. I see this in large organizations in my day-to-day job, but also in the research. It's a top-down approach. That's buy-in from management, buy-in from people that are potentially making the financial decisions in terms of investment, training, technology, and hardware as well. And that's where you'll see the greatest benefits. Garcia et al. Then they established a BIM framework for small home building businesses as well. Initial BIM adoption setup, BIM high performance work practices, what that looked like as well, and then into progression and innovative BIM knowledge acquisition as well. So they established this framework that we see on screen here as well. And then they established across the phases and effectiveness of BIM implementation. So they looked at the initiation, stabilization, progression, and so on and so forth across time, and then those BIM implementation phases, and then the effectiveness of BIM at that particular point in time. And we see that increases as the graph moves up to the right-hand side. And then just one of the final key papers that I've been looking at as well, this particular paper in Australia for small and medium enterprises revealed that a lack of reliable quantification methods for return on investment associated with BIM significantly affects the organization's commitments to implement BIM. So as part of my literature review, it then obviously, pushed me in a further direction towards my other research objectives as well. And then just in summary, what we looked at, there's a lack of research into small BIM adoption. Cost of technology investment is quite a common barrier. Particularly if we look at in Ireland, there are solutions around that, things like Enterprise Ireland grants, all of that being available there as well. There's a BIM knowledge gap in staff. That's quite common, came across a lot of the research. Return on investment calculation prior to implementation actually improves the adoption. People know what they're aiming for then effectively. And then cumulative small wins across the value chain bring greatest efficiency. So looking at it holistically, design firms, quantity surveyors benefits then, as well as, if there's an end user, depending on the small project, the end user doesn't always necessarily have a benefit to BIM, and that needs to be established depending on the type of project that it is. So then, based on that literature review, I then started to look inwards a bit more into the industry effectively, what's happening in different parts of the industry globally as well. And I looked at small BIM in the industry, and certainly to point out what in Ireland anyway, is this fantastic guide that's being produced by the RIII in September 2022, BIM Guide for SMEs, and effectively it's a detailed breakdown of BIM for small projects. And as they said in this particular document, BIM has to be experienced to be understood, and that quite complements to the pilot project approach as well. So it's kind of testing it depending what your different size of organization is, and I'll show that in the next graph as well. So 3 essential stages that the RII guide suggests is things like lonely BIM, collaborative BIM, which is lonely BIM plus 3D collaboration, and then collaborative BIM to ISO standard as well. Oh, sorry, let's skip that. And then they broke down the different types of small firms or micro firms effectively, because everybody's going to have every scale of firm is going to have a different need of BIM growing out through their projects. The return on investment point that I mentioned as well. So you may be familiar with the Scottish Trust has a return on investment BIM tool. I did test this for a 250,000 euro project, but results, they suit a larger project is what I'll say. The tool is not suited to small projects, which is understandable, BIM being primarily for larger projects. So that's maybe a gap of something that could be established within Ireland. I also then looked at, you may have heard David Miller Architects, they produced case studies based on their own firms as well. So, I pulled out some of the key points that they found in their learnings. Things like their tipping point for moving to BIM was from 2D to 3D. They were a 4-person firm. They're now 30-person firm, by the way. And it enabled them to compete for larger publicly funded projects needed to move to BIM as well. So that's what BIM gave them. They put in place, for example, a 6-day training schedule broken down into 40-minute slots to suit their different staff, rather than taking people out of the organization for 2 days, 3 days at a time. Effectively, they broke it down. And then for new starters, they actually put them on a 3-day starter boot camp before they started any project, so they know processes, standards, modeling techniques. All of that is firmly taught to them or spread knowledge at the start. And they also assigned a staff champion, what I found most interesting, to each part of the workflow. So they looked at their different workflows internally, and they assigned a different individual to different workflows. I think that's quite an interesting way, rather than one single person necessarily looking at all workflows as well. So then I'll just move it on time. So then in Singapore, for example, BIM, as we know, is mandated on any project under 500 square meters. And when I look at small projects, I tend to think of projects below that 500 square meter. So what Singapore have also done, and they produce a similar type of guide as well to what we've seen with the RII. And effectively what they've established is they defined, okay, these are the areas that a small project should entail. And then they guide or give guidance on what areas they can also admit from BIM, the BIM guidance documents as well. So they've broken down their master BIM set guidelines for Singapore local government or council, and they've established, okay, well, smaller firms only need to look at these particular areas as well. So that's happening in the industry. And then just to finish off on some case studies, I've also commenced myself with separate design firms in Ireland. So the methodology I've used for this is I've compared BIM time versus traditional time spent. I've done qualitative interviewing of project stakeholders, and then I've critically analysed the limitations and or the benefits of BIM to establish potentially if we should move towards an SBIM or small BIM standard. And for example, one of the projects was a retail fit out. What we saw in that for a 4-person engineering firm in Dublin, they had earlier design sign off by the client. And as a result of that, they actually won the next fit out project based on the 3Ds that they had provided from a BIM modeling piece of software. This is certainly not full or collaborative BIM, I'll certainly point that out, but they did have benefits for this particular project. And this actually increased the firm's commercial project focus. And then for a home extension, for a freelance architect, I also looked at this as well. With this particular individual, there was a design visualization benefit. Earlier design sign-off again was in there as a benefit. The detailed design stage, that benefit actually varied based on the amount of time put into detailing maybe BIM modeling or detailing certain junctions or details. In some cases, it was maybe took longer time than traditional processes, and some cases it was faster. So it did vary depending on the detail. So it can be a slightly bit more nuanced in that case. And then finally, I looked at a 30 apartment scheme for a small firm architects in County Kerry in Ireland. And effectively what we found with this, there was benefit to the drawing production, but the lack of a BIM mandate coming from the client, so the client didn't request BIM effectively, to design teams, led to design teams being at different BIM levels effectively, and less of a commitment from some teams from others. Lack of senior designer BIM knowledge, then this actually made them less aware of processes. Therefore, they actually didn't know how to interact with the BIM model or the BIM modelers, or how to request for certain information. And we found this to be restrictive as well. And then floor area scheduling at tender stage was shown to be quite beneficial effectively as part of that. And very last slide, what might an SBIM standard look like? You may have design modeling standards for carbon modeling, for example, for housing or for small projects. It could be quantifications, include also quantification standards for QS information. So looking at that full value chain efficiencies being gained, and those value chain efficiencies then looking at each individual area of design on site and suppliers for small project organizations and small project type organizations in Ireland. Thank you very much.